It's been 18 years since President George W. Bush declared the war on terror after the September 11th attacks. And while his infamous mission accomplished speech prematurely declared victory in Iraq, more than 2,000 troops have been killed in Afghanistan, 20,000 injured, not to mention the 100,000 civilians killed in the 18 years since the operations began there. But from almost day one, Bush and every president since have been making big promises about getting American troops out.
The history of military conflict in Afghanistan. It's been one of initial success, followed by long years of floundering and ultimate failure. We're not going to repeat that mistake.
The days of providing a blank check are over. It must be clear that Afghans will have to take responsibility for their security, and that America has no interest in fighting an endless war in Afghanistan.
Ultimately, it is up to the people of Afghanistan to take ownership of their future. We are not nation building again.
A trove of documents obtained by the Washington Post shows the situation was not what these presidents were proclaiming. The Post is calling them the Afghanistan Papers, more than 2,000 pages of interview transcripts from a review of the war ordered by Congress. They reveal that, quote, senior U.S. officials failed to tell the truth about the war in Afghanistan, making rosy pronouncements they knew to be false and hiding unmistakable evidence the war had become unwinnable. Senior officials like Douglas Lute, a three-star Army general who served as the Afghan war czar during the Bush and Obama administrations, told investigators, quote, we were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking. I'm joined now by Stephen Kinzer, former foreign correspondent for the New York Times, now a senior fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. Good to see you, Stephen. Neta Crawford is the director of the Watson Institute's Cost of War Project and the chair of the Political Science Department at Boston University. Great to meet you. Thanks for being here. Either of you surprised by what you read, starting with you, Stephen?
Absolutely not. I was glad to see the Washington Post put that stuff on the front pages, but I'm reminded of the old Casablanca line. I'm shocked to learn there's gambling going on in this establishment. It's nice to see also the Washington Post being the vehicle for this, but I'm waiting to see when the Washington Post and the other large media establishments will look at themselves, look in the mirror, and ask what was their role in just being the scriveners, the stenographers of power that allowed the rest of us to buy into all this, what we now know to be a false narrative.
Were you surprised by this, Neta?
No, and in part because looking at this over the years, what I saw was a pattern of disappearing information. So there's the declaration of success, and then information that would help us understand whether the war was successful was lost or no longer reported.
Daniel Ellsberg, the man who leaked the Pentagon Papers, was asked whether he thought these could be analogized to those documents, the Pentagon Papers about the Vietnam War. He said he thought it was a favorable analogy. Do you?
That's fair.
And do you think it's fair?
Yeah, I agree. Both of them showed not only that we were, as American people, given false information, but the people who were giving us that information knew it was false.
So is this an eternal condition? I mean, from Pentagon Papers to Afghanistan, is this an eternal condition of war in the United States?
One thing I think there is in common between Vietnam and Afghanistan is that in both cases, we realize that we've been defeated by an enemy that seems so weak it shouldn't be able to defeat us. Therefore, political leaders were not able to admit the fact that we had been defeated. Finally, Nixon was able to pull us out of Vietnam under the fig leaf of leaving another government behind and waiting for that government to be defeated. That's the way this war is ultimately going to end.
You know, I want to talk about this issue that Stephen raised, this media being either complicit. I mean, we were either complicit or clueless with weapons of mass destruction. Do you agree with Stephen that the media didn't do its job here?
Well, the Congress didn't do its job. And the American public have let the Congress not do its job. Really, there should have been hearings about these wars from the beginning and throughout the wars. The other thing that's been missing is a serious analysis of whether or not there's any metric for success. And what we've seen is that nobody's asked in Congress or in the media, what's the metric for success, and then what's the plan to get out?
You know, I don't have either of your expertise, so I guess I was a little more surprised than, I'm embarrassed to say, than you were. You read John Sopko, the Inspector General in charge of this overseeing Reconstruction. The American people have consistently been lied to. You read Barack Obama in the White House talking about al-Qaeda when al-Qaeda is not even mentioned in General McChrystal's original document. You have Rumsfeld, obviously earlier, saying I have no visibility into who the bad guys are. it's stunning. And one has to step back, I think, for people like me, and I think people there, and say, as I said, 2,400 Americans lost their lives, 100,000 civilians lost their lives. Thanks to the work of people like you, we learned what $1 trillion at minimum was spent on these things. Why is there such an inability to understand the reality of the enemy, the reality of the cultures, like we misunderstood it in Iraq?
I think there's a bigger issue, which is that we're moving into a new era now when the United States cannot control the world the way it did when you and I were growing up. And Americans are very slow to realize this. We're not ready to accept the fact that we can lose in anything we do. And so not only do we want to continue wars all over the world, we insist on winning them. And when we are not winning them, we want to hear someone telling us that we are.
But that wasn't the case during Vietnam. We did control the world during Vietnam. We may not control the world during Afghanistan.
This is the most frustrating part of it, that the war seems so unequal that we should be able to triumph. Now I think Americans finally have to realize, particularly since the end of the Cold War, that we're entering into an era where we are going to have to face other kinds of challenges besides military ones, and realize that these overseas wars are making it impossible for us to fund all of the things that presidential candidates are saying we need in America.
Do you buy this analysis?
I think it goes much further back. If you look at the promises that were made in Afghanistan and also in Iraq, that these wars would be quick, controllable, effective at eliminating the militants, those promises couldn't be met, because if you look at past wars, let's say the War of 1812, the Civil War, the 1899 invasion of the Philippines, Vietnam, Korea, every war we go to, we think that we're going to win quickly. It's going to be cheaper than the alternatives, that it will be effective, and that's never been the case.
But this my second naive question of this interview: how do these people live with themselves? I mean, I mentioned your analysis of that $1 trillion, by the way, from what I understand, does include medical care and interest, so it could be $2 trillion, right? Is that?
Yes.
But then,
could be
okay,
much higher.
so we have Jeffrey Eggers, one of the people interviewed here, retired Navy SEAL and White House staffer for Bush and Obama. What do we get for this $1 trillion effort after the killing of bin Laden? I said that Osama was probably laughing in his watery grave, considering how much we've spent on Afghanistan. So was the goal for these presidents to get out of town before we learned what they were not telling us the truth about? Is that always the goal?
To me, the most important thing for these presidents was not to tell the American people that we had lost, even though they knew it, because you don't want to be the one that brings the bad news. And we Americans, as voters, are partly responsible for this, because the presidents are correct when they say, I can't tell the Americans the truth because then they'll vote me out of office. And we would.
Okay, so what do we do now?
But I disagree with that, actually.
Sure.
I think,
well, tell us how.
I think, actually, that they believed that they could win. And the strategy has always been to spend more, to put more effort in there in the vain hope that they could win. I think
but I don't think that's shown in the papers.
I think they naively believed that if they just kept at it, they could win.
I don't agree. I think the papers show the opposite. They knew they couldn't win, and they persisted anyway for political reasons.
So the critical takeaway, I think, is what do we do now? Stephen Lynch, who's been in Afghanistan more than a dozen times, was on a radio show today, who admitted, he said, he had regularly been lied to when he was there, which sort of gives you a bad feeling about oversight. I said, so shouldn't we just get out of there? Here's what Congressman Lynch had to say.
Well, the consequences if we leave right now is to basically deliver every woman in Afghanistan into the hands of the Taliban, because they're going to take over, and we know how women are treated in Taliban territory. It's going to be a complete disaster for those women who are, fighting for their individual rights.
So that's one vote for staying. And then there's Donald Trump. Is Donald Trump, by chance, right on Afghanistan?
Well, Stephen Lynch is definitely wrong, because the result of us leaving is going to be the same whenever we do it, now or 15 years from now.
So is Trump onto something in this case? Hard for you to say.
Rhetorically, he is, but he's just not doing what he says he's doing.
Should we get out?
Absolutely.
Should we get out?
It's time. It's been time.
And what are the consequences?
I'll tell you what will happen if
Let
we
me
leave.
ask Neta first, and then back to you, Steve.
Okay. I think that we'll still be paying for these wars 10, 20, 30 years from now. That's one consequence. We need to figure out how to pay for the wars, since we've been doing it on a credit card. I think another consequence is that the resurgence we've seen, in fact, of the Taliban and al-Qaeda will continue. But we'll have to, as a consequence, turn to Homeland Security and think much more seriously about that. I think that we can't protect ourselves everywhere all the time. Afghanistan will be rougher, but it's been rougher up to the negotiations and including the negotiations. And more civilians are dying this year probably than in any previous year.
What's your assessment of the future if we get out?
It'll be very similar to what happened in Vietnam. The government will survive for perhaps a year, then the Taliban will take over, and you'll get a situation like we had in Vietnam. There'll be a period of harsh repression, then a new generation will take over, and I think you'll see a situation like we saw in Vietnam, that there'll be continued harsh rule from the top, but there'll be more prosperity, more stability, and as you saw in Vietnam, strangely, even a good relation with the United States.
We'll have to continue this in the future. Neta, thank you
Okay,
very much
thank
for
you.
coming. Appreciate it. Stephen, thanks for your time.